Bring us up to speed from your perspective where we are in Ukraine. Tanks are making their way over there. It's going to take a while to get there. In the meantime, Russia's really pressing, it appears, the Ukrainians out in the east.
Well, so 2 points. First of all, the tanks that we're seeing right now, very much like the Patriot systems that were announced about a month ago, very much like the HIMARS missile systems announced a couple months ago. These are all systems that literally weeks before Western leaders were saying, no, we're not going to provide those to the Ukrainians because it's too dangerous, it's too escalatory. And as the war has continued, as the Ukrainians have been effective on the ground, and as the Russians have escalated perhaps less than some have feared, there's just been incrementally greater willingness to support Ukraine. Now, these tanks won't be game changers on the ground anytime soon. It's going to take months, but it does show the Russians that their efforts to divide NATO, to divide the Europeans, to divide the Democrats and Republicans from Ukraine is not happening anytime soon. There is extraordinary level of consolidation from the entire Western alliance, even including countries like South Korea and Japan getting on board, that certainly has to make Putin very unhappy indeed.
Unhappy, but any inclination to change his mind. I mean, he misjudged Zelensky, we think. He misjudged NATO. He's made a number of misjudgments here, but I don't see any indication he's inclined to sort of change his mind, which is ultimately what we have to accomplish, isn't it?
Well, I mean, he has been changing his mind, but not in the way that we'd like. Remember, he used to call this a special military operation. Now he calls it a war. He didn't want to engage in further call-ups of Russian citizens. Now he's had a mobilization of some 300,000 men, and he's going to probably expand that in the coming months. So this is putting more pressure on Putin domestically over time. But so far, the fact that the West has come together has only led to a Russian government that is continued to be very, very focused on making the Ukrainians pay a direct cost. And as a consequence, what do we see? We see efforts to engage in widespread bombing of civilian architecture. And that's just, again, the suffering that's being right now being borne on the shoulders of the 44 million Ukrainians continues to go up.
Earlier, obviously, there was concern about possible use of nuclear weapons, something that Vladimir Putin himself raised, and that seems to have gone by the way, at least for the moment. But there is a question about whether we could get dragged into this in one shape or way or another. We have a question actually from a viewer, which is related to that, and what are the specifics are. Is there a risk? Basically, this says if, in fact, American merchant vessels were carrying U.S. weapons over, could they become targets for Russian naval attacks? I'm not sure if the Russian Navy has the capability for that, but whether it's that way or another way, is there a risk actually we could get really caught up in this war?
The Russians, well, we are caught up in the war. The fact is that the West is providing tens of billions of dollars of direct weaponry with the intention to kill more Russians that are invading Ukraine. There is intelligence being provided. There's direct training of Ukrainian army on the ground in the United States and in NATO countries. So this is a war by proxy from NATO with Russia. It's not a Cold War, it's a hot war. Now, the fact is that the Russians so far have understood that directly targeting NATO forces could lead those NATO countries to get directly involved in a war with the Russians.
And we were just talking about the possibility of a hot war, but I wanted to talk about the other side of that. In your note this week, you talked about the balance between the military aspects and the economic, suggesting, as I took you to be saying, we need to ramp up the economic. Give us a sense of where we are on that part of it.
Yeah, because, I mean, what we've been talking about are the tanks, now the F-16s, and there's been a lot of consolidation in terms of support militarily for the Ukrainians, which has helped at least freeze Russian gains on the battlefield, push some back. But economically, as you know, there's been all of these sanctions that have been put together now, 10 rounds of sanctions that you see unanimous support from the Europeans, from the Americans as well. And yet the Russian economy last year contracted only by 3.5%. And the reason for that, of course, is because so much of what Russia produces, the rest of the world still very much needs. The Americans are not going to put secondary sanctions on countries like India and China that are buying large amounts of resources from China, business as usual, or even business more than usual, because they think that that's going to lead to bigger knock-on problems in relations with those countries that the Americans don't want. The Europeans still have the same issue. I mean, they've reduced a lot of their gas purchases, but a lot of the oil is still flowing. And not only that, but a lot of the companies that said they were leaving haven't actually divested yet. And their arguments are, well, I mean, we'd end up just selling to Russian oligarchs. Does anyone really want that? And it's a fair argument as far as it goes, but it means that the level of pressure on the Russian economy is less than the West would like. And as you were asking me before, Putin's willingness to change behavior on the basis of the military pressure and the economic pressure, well, so far, the only change in behavior from Putin has been escalation.
So, Ian, you and I have talked in the past about the rest of the world and the United States trying to get the rest of the world to come along. NATO's fine. Russia's fine. We're not getting a lot of the rest of the world. We had Janet Yellen in Africa trying to do that. I'm not sure how much success she had. But at the same time, as you look around the world, are we maybe hurting our own position in some of the positions we take, for example, in the Palestinian situation, which is very much in the news right now?
Well, this is the issue. I mean, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, just finishing a trip to Israel, and he's standing up next to America's top ally in the region, Bibi Netanyahu, and an unprecedented far-right coalition supporting him. And yet, when you talk about the Israel position vis-a-vis the Palestinians, the expansion of the settlements on the ground that the Americans oppose but don't do anything about, the death of the two-state solution and diplomacy around it, the United States is not seen in any way as a fair broker by the developing world. And the developing world is not so prepared to stand on the side of the United States on Russia-Ukraine, which hurts them economically, the sanctions that the Americans and the Europeans put on in terms of food and energy and the rest, when they feel that the United States, as long as it's not talking about white people in Europe, feels and acts very, very differently. And so the Americans don't have Brazil on their side on Russia. They don't have the South Africans on their side. They don't have the Indians on their side. Frankly, they don't have any of the developing world on their side. That's a majority of the world's population and a big swath of the global economy. It's a serious challenge for President Biden, who talks about the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the context of it being a fight between democracies and autocracies. There are no middle and lower income democracies that agree with President Biden in that formulation.
Ian, that's the rest of the world. What about the region itself? And what about the Abraham Accords? What risk might be posed right now to states such as United Arab Emirates? Whatever you think, the Trump administration clearly made progress in the region with respect to the Abraham Accords. Are they at risk?
The Abraham Accords are not at risk, but they're increasingly a regional effort as opposed to an American effort. The UAE, the Saudis, the Bahrainis, Kuwait, and others, they all understand that Iran is the principal national security threat that they face, and that Israel is a strategic ally in facing that threat. That facilitated the Trump administration's Abraham Accords, and that continues to move apace, even as Saudi and Emirati relationships with the United States right now are kind of in a freeze. And they don't trust the United States going forward. You'll remember that President Trump's first trip outside the U.S. after he was inaugurated was to Saudi Arabia when he put his hands on the orb. The GCC was all there. And then he went to Israel. President Biden's relations with those countries are absolutely not a priority. They're generally much weaker than they were under Trump. And I mean, compared to how the U.S. is doing with the Europeans and the Asian allies right now, the Middle East actually feels pretty forsaken.